She was given to the meanest man in town, until the Apache returned her dignity. The sun over Red Hollow was harsher than usual when they marched Alara toward the porch of the meanest man in town, its unforgiving light turning the dust into a spotlight she couldn't escape as the townsfolk cleared a path without meeting her eyes. Some out of guilt, most out of the fear that came from knowing exactly what kind of man waited at the end of that walk. Her steps dragged through the dirt as if her body understood, before her mind did that she was being delivered, handed over like a broken tool nobody wanted, her torn shawl slipping from her shoulders while she tried to hold herself small, invisible, anything that might dull the shame rising in her throat. The man waiting for her, Burke Halston, thick-shouldered, sweat-soaked, and known for breaking horses and people with the same careless hand, leaned against his post with a grin that made the crowd look away, pride swelling in him at the sight of a frightened girl being offered to him by her own kin in exchange for a debt she hadn't made. Friction rippled through the square when he reached out and grabbed her arm too hard, yanking her closer, inspecting her like a purchase rather than a person, her breath catching as she stumbled under his grip, and a few townsfolk shifted uneasily but said nothing, because nobody ever challenged Burke, not openly, not in daylight. That was when the air changed. A shadow moved at the edge of the street, quiet, deliberate, steady, and an Apache warrior stepped into the sunlight with the kind of calm that didn't need force or words to be felt. His braids were beaded, his face stern but not unkind, his posture that of a man who had seen enough cruelty to recognize the shape of it instantly. His gesture was simple but powerful. He stopped 3 paces from Burke, feet planted, shoulders squared, gaze fixed not on the crowd, but on Alara, as though she were the only truth in the square worth seeing. Burke bristled at the interruption, tightening his grip on her arm. But the warrior didn't reach for a weapon, didn't move a muscle that could be mistaken for threat. He only angled his body slightly so his shadow fell over her, a silent line drawn between what she had been given to and what she deserved instead. Fade slipped through the moment as the crowd murmured, unsure whether to fear the Apache or the man he stood against. While Alara felt, for the first time that day, her breath return in the space his presence created, a space where she was no longer just something being handed away. Burke's fingers dug harder into Alara's arm when the Apache didn't step aside, his breath sour with anger as he jerked her toward him like a trophy he refused to share. And the crowd shrank back the way people do when cruelty starts boiling over. Everyone watching, no one wanting to be involved, until the Apache finally lifted his gaze to Burke, with a calm so steady it made the whole square feel smaller, quieter, as if the dirt itself were holding its breath. Burke spat at the ground and barked, "Keep walking, savage, this ain't your business," tightening his grip until Alara winced, but the Apache didn't flinch, didn't answer, didn't give back a single shred of the hatred thrown at him. Only shifted 1 foot forward with the slow certainty of a man who understood that stepping between harm and a vulnerable person didn't require permission. It required spine. The friction sharpened when Burke tried to drag Alara past him, her body stumbling sideways as she whispered a pained apology to no one in particular, but the Apache extended a hand, not touching her, not blocking Burke, simply placing his palm flat in the air between them. A quiet barrier of refusal that needed no words to explain its meaning. Burke barked a laugh, mocking and loud, but sweat beaded at his temples because something in the Apache's stillness didn't match the victim he wanted to bring home. A stillness that said he'd already measured Burke's cruelty and found it small. Townsfolk drifted closer, drawn by a tension that hummed like a live wire as the warrior's shadow shielded Alara from the sun, from the crowd, from the man holding her. And for the first time since they marched her across the square, she breathed without shaking. The gesture that broke the moment came when the Apache reached down and lifted her fallen shawl from the dust, shaking it once to free it of dirt before draping it across his forearm like something worth protecting. And Ilara's eyes filled with tears, not because he touched her, he hadn't, but because he'd shown her more respect in one quiet motion than Burke had shown anyone in years. Fade settled into the street as the Apache finally spoke, his voice low and steady enough to rattle Burke more than any shout could. "Let her go." And the crowd felt it too, something in the air shifting. Something old and tired of men like Burke deciding the fate of others. While Ilara stood between the two men, her breath trembling as she realized the warrior hadn't come to take her. He'd come to end what was being done to her. The square didn't breathe after those 3 words left the Apache's mouth. Let her go. As if the whole town suddenly remembered every ugly thing Burke Halston had ever done, and every time they'd looked the other way, the silence thick with the kind of guilt that clings to people who convince themselves they had no choice. Burke yanked Ilara behind him, puffing up like a threatened bull, shouting loud enough for the windows to rattle. "She's mine by agreement. Her kin handed her over. The whole town saw it." As if volume could turn a cruel transaction into something righteous. Ilara's legs buckled at the reminder, shame washing through her in a heat that made her vision blur, her fingers knotting in the edge of her shawl as she tried not to crumble in front of so many watching eyes. But the Apache's presence steadied her. Not through touch, not through comfort, but through his refusal to step back even an inch. The friction sharpened when 2 townsmen, both men who owed Burke favors, moved closer as if ready to back him, their jaws tight with the kind of loyalty born not from respect, but from fear of retribution. And for a moment it looked like the Apache might be surrounded. But then something shifted. Mrs. Dallow, old, sharp-tongued, and tired of pretending she didn't see injustice, jabbed her cane against one of the men's boots and muttered loud enough for everyone to hear, "Agreement, my foot. They handed her over 'cause Burke threatened her brother last winter. Everyone knows it." A ripple of unease cut through the crowd as eyes dropped, feet shuffled, and the truth they'd all ignored suddenly felt too heavy to keep carrying. Burke whirled toward her, snarling, "Stay out of this!" But the Apache stepped forward, not threatening, not raising his hands, simply placing himself between Ilara and the growing hostility with the calm precision of a shield forged from silence. Then came the gesture that turned the murmurs into something like awakening. The Apache lifted the shawl from his arm and held it out, not to Ilara, not to Burke, but to the crowd, as if offering them a choice about the kind of people they wanted to be. The simple cloth trembled in the morning breeze, carrying the weight of what everyone had seen. A girl dragged, shamed, bartered like goods. And slowly, quietly, the townsfolk began stepping back from Burke, their shoulders dropping, their eyes refusing to meet his, until even his own allies looked more uncertain than loyal. Fade curled around the edges of the square as Burke realized, for the first time, that the town he'd ruled with fear wasn't standing behind him anymore, and Ilara, watching from the warrior's shadow, felt something strange stir inside her chest. Not safety yet, but the first fragile thread of hope tugging loose from despair. Ilara felt the shift in the crowd, like a tremor under her feet, subtle but real, and it loosened something inside her that had been coiled tight since the moment her brother's trembling hand pushed her toward Burke's porch weeks ago. The memory rising now with such force, she pressed a hand to her stomach as if steadying herself against a blow. Burke noticed the flicker in her eyes and snapped, "Not a word," his voice low and dangerous, but the Apache's quiet, unwavering presence beside her made the threat feel thinner than it ever had, like a rope frayed to its last strand. The friction tightened when Burke stepped forward and jabbed a finger at her shoulder, trying to drag her back into fear. But she didn't move. Not because she was brave, not because she felt safe, but because the Apache had angled himself just slightly in front of her. Enough that Burke's finger hit empty air instead of her skin. A silent barrier that changed everything. The town watched with a hunger for truth they hadn't admitted to themselves, waiting, listening, wondering whether the girl they'd allowed to be passed off like a burden would say what everyone had pretended not to know. Her knees shook, her breath trembled, but when she opened her mouth, the words came out raw and cracked and unstoppable. My brother agreed because Burke threatened to break his ribs again, and he said if I didn't go to him, he'd make sure our mother never walked right after the fall she took. A gasp rippled across the street. Some shocked, some ashamed, some furious that they'd suspected something like this and stayed silent anyway. While Burke surged toward her with a roar, spitting, "Lies! She's always been a liar!" But the Apache lifted one hand in a gesture so quiet it froze Burke mid-step. Not because he feared the warrior, but because the stillness in that gesture said plainly that the era of Burke's unchecked cruelty was ending. Fade gathered at the edges of the moment as Ilara's voice softened into a whisper meant only for herself. I never wanted to go. I was just too tired to fight him alone. And the town, every last watching face, finally understood that what was happening in their square was not about her looks, her worth, or her family's debt. It was about a truth no one had dared acknowledge until a silent Apache stood still enough to make them see it. The crowd's gasp still hung in the air when Ilara's legs buckled, her body sagging under the weight of finally speaking a truth she'd carried alone for too long, and the Apache stepped forward, not grabbing her, not steadying her with force, but turning his body so that his shoulder created a quiet wall she could lean against if she chose, offering support without pressure, dignity without demand. She didn't fall into him, just let her fingertips brush the edge of his arm for balance, and that tiny gesture, her choosing him instead of collapsing onto the dirt, sent another ripple through the onlookers, as though the entire town had just witnessed something sacred take root. Burke snarled at the sight, furious that she dared stand beside someone who hadn't threatened or bought or cornered her, shouting, "She's faking it. She'll say anything to get sympathy." But even he could see his words were losing their grip, the townsfolk's faces shifting from fear to discomfort to something dangerously close to doubt. The friction sharpened when the Apache reached into the small pouch at his belt and pulled out a folded piece of soft cloth, dipping it into a trough of cool water and wringing it out with the same calm precision he'd held since the moment he walked into their square. He held the damp cloth near her cheek, offering it without touching her skin, waiting for her silent permission. Ilara blinked at him, breath hitching, then nodded once, barely perceptible, and he lifted the cloth to dab the corner of her mouth where a bruise bloomed in fading purple, one Burke had left days ago when she'd flinched from his hand. A few townsfolk gasped at that, and others looked away, unable to deny what the bruise proved. Ilara's shoulders shook, not from pain but from the shock of being tended to gently for perhaps the first time in her adult life, and her fingers tightened around the shawl that still hung from the Apache's forearm like something he was keeping safe for her until she could carry it herself again. Burke lunged, trying to snatch her back, but the Apache stepped sideways with such simple certainty that Burke's grasp closed around nothing but air, the warrior's body forming a quiet shield that didn't threaten, didn't provoke, only protected. Fade settled into the square as the townspeople finally began stepping away from Burke, creating a widening circle of space around the Apache and Ilara, space that looked suspiciously like respect. And as she closed her eyes against the cloth he held with such care, she realized this was the first moment in months she felt the faint outline of her dignity returning. Slowly, tentatively, but undeniably hers again. The square had never been this quiet. Not during fights, not during fire alarms, not even the night lightning split the church steeple. because this silence wasn't fear or shock anymore. It was the sound of a community realizing it had been looking at cruelty for years and calling it Burke being Burke. Elara stood very still beside the Apache, the cool cloth resting lightly against her cheek as she steadied her breath, her fingers trembling more from the sudden release of tension than from any wound, and the warrior's calm presence beside her didn't fill the silence. It deepened it, made it heavy, made it honest. Burke sensed the shift like a kicked hornet nest and tore the cloth from her cheek, flinging it to the ground as he roared, "She belongs to me! Her brother agreed! You all saw it!" But even as he shouted, nobody stepped forward to support him this time. No nods, no muttered agreements, not even the usual fearful lowering of eyes. Two of his usual drinking companions took a half step back. The blacksmith folded his arms. Mrs. Dallow tapped her cane twice in open disapproval. The friction turned sharp when Burke seized Elara by the wrist, harder than before, hard enough to make her gasp aloud. But before the sound could even fade, the Apache moved. Not quickly, not aggressively, but with the quiet decisiveness of a man who had just reached the limit of what he would allow. He set his hand around Elara's forearm, not pulling her away, just breaking Burke's grip with a twist so gentle and controlled it was more refusal than force. Burke stumbled back a step, caught off guard. And the Apache angled his body so fully between them that Elara disappeared behind the breadth of his shoulders, his braids brushing his back as he dipped his chin in a silent warning Burke actually paused to interpret. No one in Red Hollow had ever seen Burke hesitate. It shook them. It shook him. He spat at the ground, sweat running down his neck as he tried to recover his swagger, but his voice cracked when he shouted, "You think you can take what's mine?" The Apache didn't answer. He reached down, retrieved the cloth Burke had thrown aside, rinsed the dust from it, and folded it again with deliberate calm before placing it back into Elara's hands. An act so respectful the crowd felt it like a slap to every injustice they'd allowed. Fade drifted through the street as a new murmur rose, soft at first, then spreading. He's right. She shouldn't have been given to him. This was wrong from the start. And in the center of the square, under the harsh sun that had exposed everything, Elara held the freshly washed cloth with a steadiness she hadn't known she possessed, watching the Apache stand tall before her, as if reminding an entire town that dignity wasn't something a cruel man could give or take. It was something being returned to her now, piece by piece, in silence. Burke's face reddened until it matched the dust under his boots, fury pulsing through him in a way the town had seen 100 times. Only this time, no one rushed to placate him. No one tried to calm him. No one pretended he was just having a bad day. He stood alone in a circle of people who were finally seeing him as he truly was, and that isolation hit him harder than the Apache's quiet defiance. Elara clutched the folded cloth to her chest, her heartbeat loud in her ears, but her fear wasn't as sharp as before, because she wasn't standing in front of Burke anymore. She was standing behind someone who hadn't raised a hand, hadn't drawn a weapon, hadn't spoken more than a few words, yet had somehow changed the entire shape of the square just by refusing to look away. The friction twisted when Burke drew himself up and shouted, "You're all cowards! Letting an outsider tell you what's right? Letting him take what's mine?" His voice echoed off storefronts, but the blacksmith muttered to the man beside him. She was never his. Mrs. Dallow tapped her cane again, 3 sharp strikes this time, and said loudly, "We've been letting Burke run this town with fear for too long." A murmur followed her words, spreading through the crowd like a long-delayed awakening, and Burke panicked, not visibly, not dramatically, but in the small twitch of his jaw and the way his hands curled into fists he didn't dare swing, because now he wasn't just standing against the Apache, he was standing against the truth. He lunged forward anyway, aiming not for Ilara but for the Apache's shoulder, as if one shove could undo the unraveling of his authority. The Apache didn't flinch, didn't shift, didn't brace. He simply stepped into Burke's path with a quiet, steady certainty, placing one hand flat against Burke's chest, not pushing, not threatening, just stopping, and the motion destroyed Burke more thoroughly than a punch could have. It told him that his strength meant nothing against someone who refused to be ruled by it. The townsfolk watched, breath caught in their throats, as Burke stumbled back a half step, shock flickering through him, and in that tiny slip Ilara saw something she'd never seen in him before. Fear. Real fear. Fear of losing the town. Fear of losing control. Fear of a mirror finally being held to him. Fade seeped into the corners of the square as the Apache lowered his hand and stood tall, shoulders relaxed, eyes steady, his silence saying what no one else had dared to put into words. You may be feared, Burke Halston, but you are no longer obeyed. And in the shadow of that truth, Ilara felt the first strong heartbeat of freedom pulse inside her, fragile but undeniable, as if dignity, long stolen, was already making its way back to her. The street felt like a taut rope stretched between two worlds, one ruled by Burke's temper, the other held steady by the Apache's quiet strength. And everyone in Red Hollow sensed that whichever way this moment tipped, the town would remember it for years. Burke, panting now, sweat streaking down his temple, tried to gather the old swagger back into his shoulders and snapped, "You think standing there makes you a hero? She's mine by agreement. I can take her home right now and none of you would dare stop me." But the townsfolk didn't shift or shrink the way they used to. Instead, they formed an uneven circle around Burke and the Apache, a ring that didn't imprison either man, but made something else unmistakably clear. The town was watching this time. Really watching. Ilara stood behind the Apache, the damp cloth still in her hands. Her shawl slipping but not falling, her breath trembling as she realized the decision unfolding wasn't just between two men. It was about whether she would walk home free or in chains made of silence and community cowardice. The friction tightened when Burke stepped toward her again, trying to reach past the Apache's shoulder as if reclaiming a possession. But the warrior shifted just enough to block Burke's path, his stance widening, his boots planted with the silent declaration of a boundary finally drawn. Then came the gesture that broke the last thread of Burke's grasp on the town. The Apache moved aside. Not away from Ilara, but just enough so she stood fully in view of the crowd, not hidden, not shielded, not diminished. And then, in a voice low enough that only the closest could hear, but hard enough that it carried anyway, he said, "Ask her. She decides." Gasps cut through the square like wind through wheat. No one had asked Ilara anything in months. What she wanted, where she wished to go, who she believed herself to be. Burke wheeled around, roaring, "She don't get to decide. I was promised." But the Apache lifted a hand, not to silence him, not to threaten him, but to signal the truth in front of dozens of witnesses. Ilara was no longer something to be bartered. She was someone with a voice. Fade wrapped the square as every eye turned to her. She felt the weight of fear, of humiliation, of months spent shrinking herself small enough to survive. But she also felt the Apache's calm at her back, steady, unmoving, certain. And with her hands trembling around the folded cloth, she found her voice. "I will not go with him." The words weren't loud, but they didn't have to be. The town heard. Burke heard. The ground itself seemed to still beneath her feet as the truth settled. Her dignity, stolen, crushed, traded, had been returned in a single moment when a man who owed her nothing simply stepped aside and let her be seen. The silence after her words, "I will not go with him," was the kind that presses its palms against every window, Every doorway, every breath in a place that has spent too long pretending it didn't know what it knew. The townsfolk didn't cheer, didn't gasp, didn't whisper, because something deeper was happening. Their shame was catching up to them, settling heavy in their lungs as they looked at Alara, not as a burden passed around by men, but as a woman finally allowed to speak her own truth. Burke stood frozen, his mouth half open, fury choking him like a rope he'd tied around his own throat. He swung toward the townspeople, desperate, sweat shining on his forehead as he barked, "Well, someone tell her she can't say that? Someone tell him he can't let her?" But no one moved. Not the blacksmith. Not the storekeeper. Not even the two men who used to drink with Burke and whisper cowardly excuses for his cruelty. Mrs. Dallow lifted her cane and pointed it straight at him, her voice brittle but unwavering. "You heard her. She's not going." Burke flinched as though struck. The Apache didn't step forward this time. He didn't need to. His stillness had done all the speaking hours ago, and now the town, who had always watched from behind curtains, was finally stepping out into the light. The friction sharpened when Burke tried one last desperate lunge for Alara's wrist, rage blistering across his face, but the blacksmith caught his arm mid-swing and growled, "Enough!" A second man grabbed Burke's other shoulder. A third stepped between him and the Apache, not to protect the warrior, but to show Burke the crowd didn't fear him anymore. Alara watched with wide, tear-filled eyes, the cloth trembling in her hands, as the people who had ignored her shame now blocked Burke from reaching her, people who had chosen silence until today, but were choosing differently now. The Apache finally moved, not toward Burke but toward Alara, standing slightly to the side so she could see everything clearly and understand. No one was speaking for her anymore. They were speaking beside her. Burke roared, struggling, spitting curses, but the townsmen dragged him back, and with every step he was pulled, his power shrank like a fire-doused bucket by bucket. He shouted at the crowd, "You'll regret this, all of you." But his threat sounded small now, thin and brittle, like a man who had lost the one thing he'd always relied on: fear. Fade softened the square as Burke was hauled toward the sheriff's porch, kicking dust, while Alara, trembling but standing, finally felt the world shift under her feet. Not because the Apache had saved her by force, but because he had stood still long enough for the truth to rise, for the town to choose what was right, and for her voice to be heard in a place where she had once been invisible. In that quiet, with the dust settling and the sun losing its harsh edge, she realized something she had not dared believe since winter. She was no longer alone. Dawn slipped into Red Hollow without apology, softening the sharp corners of the buildings and washing the dust with a pale gold that made the whole town look unfamiliar, almost gentle, and Alara stepped out onto the quiet street with the folded cloth in her hands, its edges still damp from where the Apache had rinsed away the dirt Burke flung at it. The square where everything happened only hours before felt bigger now, not because the crowd was gone, but because her fear no longer filled it, and the morning air carried a cool stillness that settled her heartbeat into something steadier, something her body barely recognized. The Apache stood a few paces away, not watching her directly, just keeping her in the corner of his sight as he leaned against the hitching post with the calm of a man who had stayed awake through the night. Not out of duty, but to make sure the shadows did not gather around her door again. His presence was the same as it had been from the moment he stepped into the square, quiet, respectful, steady, and in the stillness of the early hour she realized the most shocking thing about him was that he had never once expected her gratitude, her obedience, or her debt. He had come because cruelty crossed his path. He had stayed because she had needed space to stand. The friction of memory flickered in Alara's chest when she glanced toward Burke's cabin at the far end of town. the place she had been meant to live, meant to serve, meant to diminish herself into nothing to survive, and for a brief moment her knees weakened. But then she breathed in the cool air, the scent of morning bread, the faint echo of Mrs. Dallow's cane tapping proudly on the boardwalk earlier, and strength returned to her legs. The Apache finally approached her, slow and unhurried, stopping at a distance close enough for conversation, but far enough for choice, and nodded toward the open road stretching out of town, the mountains rising in soft blue layers beyond the ridge. He didn't tell her where to go. He didn't tell her what was expected. He simply said, in the same quiet tone he'd used when he told Burke to let her go, "You choose your next place." The words struck something deep inside her, something long buried under months of shame and silence. And she felt tears sting her eyes, not from fear, but from the shock of being given what no one had offered her in far too long. Choice. She looked at the road, then at him. Then at the square that had once felt like a prison, and now felt like the first place she had ever been truly seen. And she whispered, with a trembling breath, "Anywhere that isn't his." The Apache dipped his head once, as if honoring a decision sacred to her and no one else, and stepped aside, not leading her, not following, but clearing the path so she could step into the morning as a woman whose dignity had been returned in full. Fade settled into the warmth of dawn as Alara walked forward, light pooling around her feet with every step, and the Apache fell into a quiet, respectful distance behind her, not claiming her, not guiding her, just walking close enough so that the town would understand exactly one thing. She was free. Please like, share, and subscribe to support more true-hearted Western frontier stories on Stories Left Behind. If you saw a woman being handed to the cruelest man in town, would you have stepped between them like the Apache did, or stayed silent like everyone else? Tell us in the comments.